closed primaries are absolutely toxic to a functioning state legislature and to a functioning state. I was there at a time when closed primaries basically meant if you were Republican and you did the right thing, you might lose your seat. That's a tough thing for people. And I think it's impressive when you look back, there were quite a few Republicans who consciously made the decision to do the right thing and risk their seat because they knew bipartisanship was the right thing to do. They did it.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Representative Zack Fields, who has represented downtown Anchorage in the Alaska State House for the past 6 years. He began his work in Alaska in 2012, doing political work for first the AFL-CIO and later as communications director for the Alaska Democratic Party. During Bill Walker's gubernatorial administration, Zack Fields served as the Workforce Development Coordinator for the Alaska Department of Labor and Workforce Development. He is currently a union organizer for the Laborers Union Local 341.
Zack Fields, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Andrew.
You grew up in Virginia?
Yep. I grew up in Richmond, a suburb outside of Richmond.
Born and raised?
Well, I was born in Charlottesville, and then my family moved to Richmond shortly thereafter, and I grew up in Richmond.
And what did your parents do?
My mom worked for the Virginia Municipal League, and my dad was a social worker.
Did you have siblings growing up?
My younger brother, Grady, is 5 years younger than me.
What was your childhood like?
I had a great childhood. My family was lower middle class, so we weren't taking European vacations or anything, but there was about 3 acres of woods behind my house. I got to go play in the woods all the time. I was a Boy Scout, and I liked the Boy Scouts because I got to go canoeing and hiking and backpacking. And really the only thing I didn't like growing up is that I lived in the suburbs and we didn't have that many parks nearby, and I didn't get to spend enough time canoeing and hiking and doing those kinds of things.
And social work, were you done like a therapist?
He was a case manager who helped people with a range of intellectual and physical disabilities live as independently as possible. Some people could live mostly independently, and maybe he would check in on them. This is from memory. It could be a little off, but once a month, and other clients had more acute needs, and maybe he was working with them almost every day. You know, from an early age, that really taught me the value of people living independently. And it's amazing. People can have pretty severe disabilities and live pretty independently if they just have a little bit of support. And obviously, we deal with a lot of those kind of policy questions on the HES committee. And I've always thought the value of a person's independence and autonomy is priceless.
Your mom's work with the Municipal League, was that what got you interested in politics?
Richmond is a small town, like Alaska is a small town. So everyone knows each other. I wouldn't say my mom got me involved in politics. I grew up in a very racially segregated community. I grew up in Henrico County, which is right outside Richmond. The history of the west end of Henrico County is that's where white people moved out after Brown versus the board, so their kids wouldn't have to go to school with black people. Now, that's obviously not why my family moved there decades later, but I grew up in a school system that was de facto segregated, and the criminal justice system in Virginia was very segregated and had the effect of enforcing an apartheid system. The history of both de jure and de facto racial discrimination in Virginia goes back as far as the colony. And I think growing up in such a profoundly racist environment is really what made me get involved with politics, because I just thought it was outrageous. One of my good friends in, I think it was first grade, a guy named Brent, whose family had immigrated from Jamaica. We were in first grade together. Brent was very smart. And after that year, Brent, who was black, was tracked into the low achieving track academically, while I was tracked into the high achieving track because of our skin color. There was zero difference in our intellectual ability, at least as far as I could tell. That is how a Jim Crow education system works. That was one of my earliest experiences with what I call apartheid, because it is a systemic way of separating people by race. And I just thought it was outrageous. And there were so many manifestations of apartheid in the South where I grew up. And I think it just, I really look back and I think if you grow up in a system like that, a system with such profound segregation, either you force yourself to become inured to it or you grow callous to it so you're not outraged, or it makes you really angry. And it made me really angry. And my family was from Alabama. My grandmother still lives there. My grandmother, who, if anyone got me into politics, it was actually my grandmother and her life experience. Parents grew up in an era where the people who owned factories in Birmingham controlled Bull Connor to use a captive black labor force for free or cheap labor. And people who think that racism and apartheid in the South was a result of poor people who didn't like black people, rednecks, no. Apartheid was an economic system designed to exploit black labor. And there was an entire education and criminal justice system apparatus to sustain that system of apartheid. The irony is, of course, it's actually horrible for poor white people, which is most of my family. And it's terrible for economic growth. I grew up in that system. I was outraged by it, and that's what drove me into politics.
Were you outraged by it in first grade?
I think kids have a very basic sense of justice, and it made no sense to me when my friend Brent was tracked into the slow class because he was black.
And you had some awareness of that even then.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
We talked about this before. I have a very similar childhood. I grew up in Texas. I grew up in an all-white community. Just up the freeway, the next exit was an all-black community.
Right.
But growing up, I just thought that was normal. Like when we played football, there was an all-black team against the all-white team that lived just a couple of miles from each other. I never questioned that.
Obviously, I grew up in the South at a time of rapid transformation. Immigration. Virginia today is not the Virginia I grew up in, but I grew up in essentially the vestige of an apartheid state.
I would say that my particular part of Texas has not changed that much. It's not that much more integrated. I think it's still the same all-black team playing a virtually all-white team with very little change. I'll also just say that I grew up with parents and grandparents who accepted it as normal as well. So that I don't know if your parents commented on the injustice or not, but my parents certainly didn't. My grandparents definitely didn't.
Yeah, I mean, my parents did. I mean, they were not super active politically, but they moved out of Alabama because they wanted me to grow up in a less horrible environment. But most of my family is still in Alabama, and I think a lot of them were both aware of the system. It was also where they lived. Poor people in a lot of cases don't really have a choice of where they live. One of my uncles actually worked on the Birmingham police force while Bull Connor was the sheriff during the heart of the civil rights movement. And my uncle put Martin Luther King in jail. But my uncle was supportive of civil rights. And in his role as one poor person in the system, saw it as being important to treat this person with dignity. That's the complex reality of poor white people in a system of profound racial segregation.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to college at University of Virginia.
And what did you study?
Economics was my major and history was my minor.
Was there a particular era of history that you were most interested in?
UVA is an amazing college, certainly a testament to the power of public universities. And I had a lot of awesome professors. But one class where I got to focus a little bit more was with a professor named George Gillum. And basically we were assigned to do an academic paper. And the paper I wrote was on the struggle to unionize coal mines in southern West Virginia in the early 20th century. Coincidentally, the lawyer for the United Mine Workers, the lawyer was named Jet Locke. Of course, John Lewis was the president of the mine workers at the time. The papers of Jet Locke happened to be housed at the University of Virginia. So I went down there and read Jet Locke's papers, which included both kind of his correspondence, but also just a bunch of news clippings, records from congressional hearings. And the paper is called Progress at Gunpoint, and I think it's available on the internet. And it was fascinating history, and I learned a lot. I did not know that people who lived in West Virginia in the early 20th century generally didn't have title to their land. And when companies, the plurality of whom were based in Philadelphia, learned about both coal and timber resources in West Virginia, these corporations basically stole land from West Virginians to develop coal mines and strip West Virginia of timber. And it was a very violent process. The interesting thing, it was documented in the New York Times, these companies stealing land from people who we now call rednecks. And that history actually culminated in the origin of the term redneck, which as either 1919 or 1920, there was a county where the coal company controlled law enforcement. And there was a neighboring county where there was a democratically elected sheriff who was supportive of the United Mine Workers. These were both non-union counties. The United Mine Workers were working to unionize the last 4 counties that were not unionized in the coal fields of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. So the sheriff, who was controlled by the coal companies, issued a warrant for the neighboring town sheriff. The neighboring town sheriff, who I think his name was Zack Fields, responded to that warrant, showing up on the courthouse steps, and the coal company sheriff, Don Chapin, murdered him in cold blood on the courthouse steps, basically in a power play to take over the judicial system in that neighboring county. And after that happened, residents of the area rose up and actually went to war with the coal companies and what came to be known as the Battle of Blair Mountain. There's a great book called The Battle of Blair Mountain. I encourage anyone to read it who's interested in economic history in the United States. And basically, in the Battle of Blair Mountain, it was a very long struggle. Mercenaries for the coal companies fought with union supporters. Union supporters wore red bandanas. That is the origin of the term redneck, is union supporters. So I use that term with pride personally. And after several months, I believe Harding was the president at the time. Harding actually sent planes to drop bombs on West Virginia. And so it was the first time that planes were used to drop bombs on Americans. And the miners lost that struggle. And the coal miners did not succeed in unionizing those coal mines in southern West Virginia until the Roosevelt administration, which speaks to the nexus between political power and the ability of people to support their families. The other really crazy thing from that era, which a lot of people don't know about, is a few years before that, the coal companies, in an attempt to deter unionization, actually built this armored train with machine guns, and they would drive the train through camps where there were union sympathizers and wantonly murder families. And they had a name for this train. It was called the Bull Moose Special because they were driving around at the time that Teddy Roosevelt was running. It's on the Bull Moose tickets. I work for a labor union, and I think unions are incredibly important because when you look back, the history of trying to get a decent wage and benefits for middle-class families is not really a history of sitting down and having a rational negotiation. It is a history of warfare in America, and we're very lucky to be where we are now, where coal companies can't drive armored trains through small towns and wantonly murder women and children, because that's what happened 100 years ago.
I appreciate that history. I'm glad you brought that up. I think something that I feel like I'm constantly having to push back on is when people talk about how things today are the worst they've ever been.
Definitely not.
And yeah, dropping bombs is not happening today. And
yeah, the president has not dropped bombs on civilians in America in a long time. As violent as America was in the early 20th century, again, much of that violence directed by large corporations and mercenaries with impunity, there were also a lot of inspiring stories in the coal fields of southern West Virginia. When those coal operators were trying to break strikes by the United Mine Workers, they brought in trains of black people who they intended to use as scabs to break the strikes. And the interesting thing is, the United Mine Workers was a progressive union at the time, and the mine workers, when the black people would get off the train, would say, hey, we're all in it together. We need to strike for good wages, regardless of our skin color. So there were no black people in West Virginia, essentially, before coal companies brought them in on trains. And it's a really inspiring history to look at how UMW embraced black people and fought on behalf of everyone's common humanity.
And studying that history in college and going to look at the papers in the library, was that when you got inspired by unions?
I don't even think I knew what a labor union was before reading those papers. And I did that purely as a research project for college. And I still didn't really understand unions for a long time. I ended up working in Congress as a congressional staffer on a postal union bill. And that's where I started to understand the relevance of labor unions and public policy today, when there was a sort of a coalition of labor unions, Don Young and other representatives from around the country who fought to preserve the Postal Service at a time when it was really under threat. And that's what I understood the modern relevance. But yeah, reading the papers of Jet Locke and the United Mine Workers was my first real exposure to union history in America.
So you mentioned Don Young. Can you talk about what happened after college?
Sure. Yeah, so I worked for a local government official named Jerry Conley. He got elected to Congress. I worked for him on oversight and government reform issues, which is where I got to know Don Young's staff. And I was a young guy, and I grew up as a staunch Democrat in Virginia, and Don Young really taught me the power of bipartisanship.
I guess it speaks to our lives today, working in the Alaska legislature, that we have bipartisan coalitions, and that's not something that's that common in the rest of the United States. And I also think that Don Young is stereotyped as being a Republican's Republican.
Yeah. I tell a lot of people Don Young is actually a model for what a congressman should be. He was certainly a Republican. He had deeply held beliefs that most people would call conservative. And he had outstanding working relationships with Nancy Pelosi, primarily Steny Hoyer, former high-ranking in Democratic leadership, and a ton of Democrats and Republicans and senators and presidents. Don Young knew how to build relationships through, I think, 6 administrations, probably more, in D.C. We had a Labor and Commerce hearing on the infrastructure bill where Senator Murkowski, Senator Sullivan, and Congressman Young were there. This was, I think, a few months, maybe a year before Congressman Young died. And Congressman Young actually shared the story of how the infrastructure bill passed, which is actually really interesting to me. This has never been in the paper. It's never been in Politico. It's never been in the New York Times. The way the infrastructure bill passed is, of course, Lisa Murkowski essentially wrote it, and both of our senators helped pass it through the Senate. Wide bipartisan vote. I think 67 senators voted for the infrastructure bill. But when it came over to the House, Nancy Pelosi was Speaker at the time, and she had something like a 3 or 4 seat majority, one of the narrowest majorities in U.S. history. And there were a number of her members who were very progressive, and they didn't support the infrastructure bill because they wanted a Green New Deal instead of a bipartisan infrastructure law, essentially. Chuck Schumer worked with our senators and a bunch of other senators on a bipartisan bill that passed with 67 votes. And to be honest, that bill was going to die in the U.S. House. As soon as it passed over to the House, Don Young, this is what he described in the Labor and Commerce hearing, Don Young whipped votes among his Republican colleagues and personally persuaded 20 of them to vote for it so that Nancy Pelosi could put that bill on the floor and pass it. And he told us, he was like, I called Nancy and I said, I got 20 votes, put the bill on the floor. Then the House Republican leadership, which was barely in the minority at the time, was engaged in this, what has become normal nihilistic DC thinking of, oh, maybe this infrastructure bill is really good policy, but passing it might incidentally help Joe Biden, so we should just block the bill and screw America in order to hurt Joe Biden. That was the Republican congressional leadership on the House side. So the House leadership basically ran in a whip operation against Don Young and persuaded 10 of the Republicans who he had previously persuaded to vote for the bill not to vote for. But Don Young was very effective and obviously had 5 decades of experience, and he held 10 votes. Basically, Don Young and Nancy Pelosi did the whip count. Don Young held 10 Republicans. Nancy Pelosi lost 5 or 6 Democrats. They put the bill on the floor and it passed. And I was just reading in the ADN, the Anchorage Daily News the other day, this headline about the Anchorage economy recovering thanks to construction. That is 100% Don Young, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and our congressional delegation, the rest of our congressional delegation. What an amazing story. And that guy was such a good congressman. And it's funny, I think there were some maybe lower information Republican voters who voted for him because from time to time he would make, politically incorrect comments that lower 48 liberals would think were horrible and write about them, in the Washington Post or something. But the reality is Don Young was an awesome congressman.
I can appreciate the importance of the infrastructure bill and grateful that it got passed. I also don't want to engage in like hagiography of Don Young. I mean, I think the most famous story that I know from folks working in DC is the knife pulled on Boehner, Speaker Boehner at the time, the Republican Speaker of the House. There was some behavior that I don't think would be a good model
I'll give
for good relationships with your colleagues.
I think Don Young, actually, like Ted Stevens, knew how to use his anger in a calculated way to protect the interests of the state. I'll give an example. Like when I was a congressional staffer, Don Young basically blocked a postal bill that would have eviscerated the Postal Service and really screwed Alaska. And that was a bipartisan postal effort at the time. Tom Carper, a Democrat from Delaware, and Darrell Issa, an arsonist and con artist, Republican who chaired the Oversight and Reform Committee, both wanted to dismantle the Postal Service. And this was at a time of kind of neoliberal economic ideology dominating DC, where, the McKinsey Corporation, which when it wasn't busy trying to help Purdue Pharma blow up the opioid epidemic, was also advising the Postal Service on how to dismantle itself so that it wouldn't serve Americans anymore. And Don Young, my former boss, and really a handful of people blocked that bill. And it was very interesting because Don Young was not the chairman of the Oversight and Reform Committee. He was not a member of Republican leadership. And he blocked that bill. He had the courage as a single Republican member, this was the Tea Party Congress, to say, no, you are not going to dismantle the Postal Service. Darrell Issa, in retribution against Don Young, actually, through the multiple versions of that bill, Darrell Issa introduced a new version of the bill one day in that session. That was the 2011-2012 session, with a whole new chapter entitled Alaska. So Darrell Issa added this entire chapter to this proposed Postal Service bill, 100% to be punitive against Don Young. What Don Young did is, Darrell Issa was a pretty big guy who was like 3 or 4 decades younger than Don Young. But anyway, old Don Young, he was old at the time, went up to Darrell Issa on the House floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, grabbed him, lifted him off the floor, and screamed in his face, "Get the fuck out of my state," after Darrell Issa introduced this bill. And guess what? Don Young won. Yeah, he could be aggressive, but he was aggressive in defense of his state. And I think it worked.
And speaking of folks in the U.S. Congress not doing things that would be good for the country so as not to help the other party or the other leadership, I think we just saw that with the border bill that was drafted by Oklahoma Senator James Langford, which ostensibly would have been a very important Republican step towards solving issues at the Mexico-U.S. border. And although it passed the Senate with quite a large margin, the House stopped it because Donald Trump asked them to, because he was afraid that it might help Biden.
Wasn't that ironic, since Biden is not actually the nominee for president? I mean, it just goes to show you just got to pass policy. Like, our job is to legislate, and God forbid we work together on something and someone gets from the quote other side. To me, there is no other side. The side is, do we legislate effectively on behalf of Alaska? Period.
Did you meet your wife in college?
Yes.
And how did you guys decide to move to Alaska?
Well, my wife is smarter and better educated than I am. So when she finished law school, she applied for clerkships where we wanted to live. And fortunately, she got one here in Alaska, so we were able to move here.
Did y'all have other options on the table, or were you really both leading into Alaska?
Alaska was certainly my top choice. That was a time when I went to college, graduated from college, went into the workforce, worked. I enjoyed the work, but I didn't want to live in the DC area long-term as much as the work is rewarding. So yes, when she got a clerkship in Alaska, I said, all right, we're moving. So that was a great time to move where we wanted to live long-term.
And what year did y'all arrive here?
2012.
2012. And did you go to work for the Democratic Party? Was that your first job when you got here?
No, I worked for the Putting Alaskans First Committee through the Alaska AFL-CIO on an independent expenditure effort in support of Hollis French and Bill Olakowski. Yeah, it was funny. I moved here without a job. I mean, my wife had a job.
Right.
So I took the summer off and did a long paddling trip. And when I got to town, actually a buddy of mine through the postal unions said, hey, should go and meet with actually Ed Flanagan and then Vincent Joel. And that's what I did.
You guys have 2 kids that you had in Alaska.
Alaska's a great place to raise a family. There are like 5 parks within a walking distance of our house. We have an amazing public school system. Zara goes to Government Hill Elementary. Simone will go there next year for Spanish immersion. I didn't have that opportunity growing up. I look around, unlike where I grew up, our kids grew up in an integrated society. Certainly there is racism, especially against Alaska Native people, and that still boggles my mind. But the world I see is Anchorage is such a better place to grow up than where I grew up, just in terms of quality of life, but also the ability for our kids to grow up without such profound structural racism.
One thing that you've really made an effort to do is to prioritize your family over legislative work, that you really do set some boundaries in the way that other legislators haven't. And I guess, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, legislatures evolved a lot. The legislature at statehood was a place where one parent worked, the legislative sessions were brief, and the whole family would go to Juneau for 3 months, do their work, and come home. And the legislature has evolved in a way that is actually very difficult for families. So now it's a 4+ month session, which is very different from 3 months. And of course, most families need 2 wage earners. From the time I've been in the legislature, very few working parents have been able to make it work because of the schedule. And the problem is that there is the old school expectation that legislators are just in Juneau for months. And that is inconsistent with the economic reality that most families need 2 working parents. I've tried to be assertive as a parent to say, hey, we have a new economic reality, 2 parents, working parents. And some families, it works to move to Juneau, and that's awesome. And I'm totally in support of that. A lot of families, it doesn't. So we have to ask ourselves a question as a state: do we want representation by working parents in the state legislature? And if we do, and if 2 parents have jobs, which most of them do, and by the way, I want working and middle class people to be representatives, and I don't want it to be solely the domain of wealthy or retired people, then guess what? Those people need to fly home on the weekend. It is very basic. It does not impede the functioning of the legislature, but it's a little bit of an adjustment for some of the old school legislators who still remember the days when everyone flew or took a ferry down and were just there for 3 months. And it's a reality that we face. And if we don't allow parents to go home on the weekend, sorry, we're not going to have parents in the legislature. And that actually has really negative ramifications for public policy. We need people in the legislature of all income groups, of all demographics, from all regions of the state. And that includes working parents. There was a year or 2 where my family did come down for a month at a time. Then they'd go back to Anchorage for a month. But I don't think it's really reasonable to tell my wife, hey, you're not going to see your friends for 4 months. And you're going to essentially be less efficient at your job because you're working from this other location. She could, but I mean, I could also commute. So I just think we should support working families in whatever way they make it work. If they move to Juneau, that's awesome. If they can't move to Juneau for family or school or whatever other circumstances, we need to make it work. And by the way, there are a ton of planes that go between Anchorage and Juneau every day, so it's really not that hard.
I think that there are other issues that make it difficult to recruit candidates and folks to run for office today, other than the fact that it is a big strain on the family.
I think a barrier is that people feel like their family may be brought into a political discussion, verbally attacked or so on, and they don't want to expose their family to that. And that's a legitimate concern. I've certainly never experienced that. But I think, I'm totally against this crazy Trump-style violent rhetoric in politics that's highly personal. It just makes no sense. It's terrible for our society, and we have to have a civil discourse. And so I try to support that because I think that is part of keeping normal people engaged in politics. And that's really, at the end of the day, like, that's the test. Can normal people be engaged in politics, normal working families?
I think one thing that you've done that's unusual is not engage in social media the way other legislators do. Some legislators are posting all the time. They're very engaged.
Yeah, I just don't use social media. I think social media has a toxic effect on our society. And I guess I could use it, but I think I'd rather model the behavior that we should actually just all disengage from social media because it's terrible for our society. So I'm just going to do that.
Do you see any downside at all that not having that social media presence in terms of getting a message out immediately or anything like that? Because Trump was famously like legislating via Twitter. That was the stereotype.
Yeah, I look at social media as something, if you engage in it, by definition, you are harming civil discourse. It is not a medium in which civil exchange can even really take place. So no, I'm just going to disengage from it.
You, during COVID, sent a letter to Mark Zuckerberg that was viewed by some of the right-wing blogs in Alaska as an attempt to ban them from social media. And I guess, can you talk a little bit about that and also just about the media landscape in Alaska in general?
Yeah, I don't really remember the details of that letter. I think it might have been something about blatantly false information that endangered people vis-a-vis COVID. But I think the broader reality is that social media is a vehicle for disinformation and fascism. That is the actual function of social media today. It's pretty amazing to me, actually, that people like Mark Zuckerberg are willing to consciously use their platforms to promote fascism. That's what they're doing. There's a great book by Jonathan Hari called Stolen Focus. And Stolen Focus, if you're interested in social media and human cognition, Stolen Focus is a nice kind of easy to read analysis of the effects of social media and the information that social media companies themselves are aware of. So, for example, there were some Facebook employees who were concerned that Facebook in Germany was empowering the neo-Nazi party Alternative for Germany. And they reported this up the chain to Facebook's, I think, board of directors. So Facebook's board of directors had a meeting and reviewed these reports and decided to do nothing because inhibiting organizing by neo-Nazis in Germany would diminish what Facebook calls engagement, i.e. shares of posts. And that to me is a microcosm of everything that's wrong with Facebook and all the other social media companies. They are literally willing to empower neo-Nazis in Germany to make a few cents on advertising. That's outrageous.
Do you see any sort of ways that government can help stop the way that social media has infiltrated our lives and has a negative effect?
Yeah, actually, the national leader on dealing with social media is the Republican governor of Utah, who this past session,
Cox?
I think that's his name, this past session passed a great bill with the Republican legislature of Utah to put in some sideboards to protect youth from social media. Social media is like cigarettes. I don't support banning social media any more than I would support banning cigarettes because it makes no sense and it would lead to a black market. And there are all kinds of reasons that prohibition doesn't work. But we also don't allow cigarettes to be sold to 4-year-olds. And when you look at the bill that Utah passed, an all Republican state, I would note, that's the kind of legislation we should be doing. Jesse Sumner introduced a bill like that. It's always hard to pass complex legislation in the Alaska legislature. But yeah, that's the model. And basically, it recognizes that adolescents' brains are not developed, and introducing addictive technologies or substances to adolescents is unacceptable. So we shouldn't do that. And there should be some accountability for these companies that are effectively merchants of death. And by the way, I would note it's not just promoting fascism. In the case of Instagram specifically, Facebook has extensively studied how Instagram is leading to higher rates of depression and suicide, especially young girls. So literally, Mark Zuckerberg is profiting by killing little girls. It is unbelievable. Facebook itself has studied this ad nauseum, and that book, Stolen Focus, goes through some of the data about just how Facebook has studied it, and they keep doing it. They're willing for more girls, little girls, to kill themselves so they can earn a little advertising money on Instagram. What kind of sick fucks are these people?
I did the ban on social media.
Okay, he introduced the bill, and then your amendment was actually like...
I did the amendment on Sarah Vance's porn bill to ban social media for folks under the age of 16. I was modeled on DeSantis' bill in Florida.
Yeah, Florida did a great bill. Yeah. But Jesse also had underlying legislation that was very similar.
You ran for office in 2018. You filed to run when Les Garrett had filed as well, and you were running for his seats. It was a pretty crowded field.
Yeah, I wasn't challenging Les Garrett, actually.
Okay. So correct me. My understanding was that Les Garrett didn't drop out until last minute.
This was all something that Les Garrett wanted to do in a particular way. It's a funny story. It's a classic Anchorage, Alaska, and particularly South Edition, my neighborhood story. So a buddy of mine was walking by Les Garrett's house, and he was like, "Hey, Les, how's it going?" And Les was like, "Oh, I'm just so frustrated with the legislature, blah, blah, blah." And my friend was like, "Oh, I mean, why do you keep doing it?" Basically, and Les was like, I don't know who would do this job." And my friend was like, "How about Zach?" And Les was like, "That's not a bad idea." And then so it turns out my wife and I were eating dinner with his friend and his wife that night. And he was like, "Representative Fields, Les Garrett wants you to be the next representative." I was like, "What are you talking about?" He was like, "Oh, I just walked by Les's house. You know how he always wants to retire. And he thinks maybe you should replace him." And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. So anyway, what Les wanted me to do is literally write a post on Facebook. I know Les Garrett wants to retire. I'd be honored to earn his support. If he does decide to retire, obviously, I think Les Garrett's awesome. I'd never run against Les Garrett. That'd be crazy. He's doing a great job. So anyway, that's what I did. It was designed to put out there to voters in our district, Les Garrett might retire, and let them know, okay, maybe someone else wants to run too. Les was very insistent on not just unilaterally picking someone because that wouldn't be fair to voters. So that's what we did. And multiple people ran.
They did.
Yeah, and it was including our colleague Cliff.
Cliff Groh, who represents Government Hill and Jay Bear.
Who's an awesome guy.
Yep.
I got to know him through that race. And it's funny, Cliff ran an awesome campaign in 2018. Obviously, I'm still friends with Elias.
Community organizer Elias Rojas.
The other person who ran, Elias, lives down the street. It's very classic South Edition kind of discussion about who's going to be the next representative.
So you got elected in 2018, sworn in 2019, it's 2024. So what's your understanding of the legislature that's different now than when you started?
Today, bipartisanship is certainly stronger than when I got elected. When I got elected, we struggled to maintain a bipartisan majority in the House. Of course, that was a time of closed primaries, and closed primaries are absolutely toxic to a functioning state legislature and to a functioning state. I was there at a time when closed primaries basically meant if you were Republican and you did the right thing, you might lose your seat. That's a tough thing for people. And I think it's impressive when you look back, there were quite a few Republicans who consciously made the decision to do the right thing and risk their seat because they knew bipartisanship was the right thing to do. They did it, even at risk to themselves politically. Credit to every single person who did that. With the advent of open primaries, now people can do the right thing and at least not get punished for it. At least have it be neutral. And that's the environment we're in today. And of course, bipartisanship is the right way to govern. And a lot of people want to do that. And every caucus today is bipartisan in the state legislature. The House majority, House minority, Senate supermajority are all bipartisan. And that's a product of open primaries.
The 33rd legislature was the first time you were in the minority. So you were to chair a committee. What's it like to start in the majority, co-chairing state affairs and moving into the minority?
Yeah, I mean, I got as many bills passed this year and as many capital budget items as in any previous year. I think one of the things about building relationships over time is you can get the job done, whatever the organizational makeup looks like. One bill that passed this year, which I was really happy about, was a bill to expand insurance coverage for breast cancer. And a lot of people worked on that bill. It ended up in a James Kaufman bill that passed, so credit to James for doing a lot of work to help it pass. Matt Clayman and Jesse Bjorkman were really helpful on the Senate side. Bill Wachowski was really helpful on the Senate side. On the House side, Jesse Sumner and Mike Prox moved that bill right through their committees. It got on the House floor. A lot of people were involved in passing that bill. You can be effective under any organization. I am very appreciative to Jolly Christ Tompkins, who agreed to let me co-chair state affairs and basically do a little apprenticeship in how to co-chair. That takes a lot of time, and it's easier to do something yourself than train someone. And he took the time to train me.
And you're running unopposed. I assume that running unopposed is better than running opposed. This would be your first unopposed race.
Oh, I was unopposed for my second term, actually. But
you were, because this is your fourth race.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but what it allows me to do is spend a lot more time volunteering for other people whose races are important, because my goal is a pro-education, bipartisan majority in the House. And of course, we need to continue to have a pro-education, pro-business, bipartisan coalition in the Senate. What I have not experienced in the legislature is an organized bipartisan majority in both chambers that can proactively legislate and reverse the outmigration that's going on in our state and restore the state on a path to prosperity. And we really need bipartisan coalitions in both chambers to do that.
Are you hopeful?
Oh, absolutely.
Mia, what are your thoughts on the upcoming election in November?
I think when you look at what voters have done is they've pretty consistently rewarded competence and bipartisanship, and in very recent election cycles, and they've pretty consistently rejected negative, divisive campaigning, which is really interesting. And that's been true in a wide range of districts, Republican districts, Democratic districts. And I think when you look at the composition of the legislature today, we are getting more and more collaborative people. And when you look at people running, like Chuck Hupp's running, very collaborative guy, right? Like way more conservative than me. Does he know how to work across party lines to get the job done? Absolutely. So there are more people like that running and winning. And that's a good thing. To me, the test is not like this abstract left-right spectrum. That is not actually relevant to the legislature at all. It's, do you want to get the job done on things that really should be centrist and nonpartisan? Education, a balanced budget, supporting public safety, supporting the kind of infrastructure investments that are necessary for economic growth. That's the important stuff. And that's right in the middle, stuff that historically was and should be nonpartisan.
I was reading a chapter in a book last night that was actually about the late 50s, early 60s, and polls of Americans where they were asked to decide if something was a liberal value or a conservative value. And they said, looking back on it, that the poll is almost meaningless because it was quite clear that no one really knew what was liberal and what was conservative, and that it ran the whole gamut.
Yeah, that was that Jill, what's her name, the Harvard professor who wrote a history.
Jill Lepore.
Jill Lepore, yeah. These Truths by Jill Lepore. It's a very interesting political scientist in the 50s were troubled that both Republicans and Democrats had common ground on things like infrastructure, investing in education, obviously racial segregation. There was disalignment within both parties. But anyway, I thought it was funny that political scientists were bothered that parties might work together. There'd be an insufficiently clear choice. These Truths by Jill Lepore, for people who haven't read it, is probably the best one-book American history that's ever been written. She is an amazing writer.
We are at the end of our time. We've mentioned 3 books.
Yeah, Jill Lepore, These Truths, Jonathan Hari, Still in Focus, and for anyone who wants to understand legislative efficacy, The Irreplaceable Master of the Senate by Robert Caro, I think, is a model for how to legislate. Imperfect person who did a lot of good for his country in a way that was heroic, and that is the model.
Zack Fields, thanks so much for being on the show today.
You bet.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call my office at 907-269-0123.